Good afternoon, folks. Hey, Commissioner McFadden. Hey, Tanisha. Hi, Cora.
Hi, Commissioner Brooks. Good to see you. How you doing?
I'm okay today. I just came back from a little run, trying to get this sunlight.
I was getting ready to say get the vitamin D because it's beautiful.
Yeah. I wish I had a little
Absolutely.
chair so I could lay out.
Right. Absolutely.
Jealous.
Yeah, it feels great. I mean, it is really great. So if you can get out and just take that walk, and it's probably good.
Nice.
It'll probably be nice until probably after 5:30, 6 o'clock too. So you might have a little time to squeeze in a little.
Just a smidget.
Yeah.
Hi, Christy.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Hello.
So Tanisha, are you doing any did you have any plans for PD this year? Because I was wondering, do you want to ever come to these conferences with us?
Oh, right. So I have done some PD already this year. I have not physically gone within the last 2 years, actually. I haven't gone physically. But yeah, I will look into that. I haven't looked into it. I will look into it. Yeah, thanks for asking.
Yeah, I feel like these, there's such interesting spaces. So like NSBA or anyone, I think it's really instructive.
Right.
But yeah, it's
much appreciated. Yeah, I'll look into it. Thank you.
For sure. Hey, Commissioner McFadden.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Sweet. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Our student commissioner messaged me saying that they were running a little bit behind. And so, Tanisha, are we waiting for Christian? Oh, there's Christian. Hey, everybody. So just want to say welcome to our March 15th Policy Committee meeting. Today, I'll call this meeting to order at 3:30 on the dot. Today, we'll have some discussions around policy ADG, around sustainability. And then we'll also have an update on sort of board rules, which I think we've been in the works for a while. So excited to hear a little bit more about that. And just to remind our presenters, if we could take no more than 20 minutes for our presentations, that would leave robust time for us to sort of be in conversation with one another. And so with that, I'm going to ask whomever is showing up for the Policy ADG sustainability presentation to take the wheel.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi.
I'm going to share my screen. Okay, is that coming through? Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm Joanna P. Sunier. I coordinate our sustainability work for city schools. I'm based in our operations office, and I'm going to be talking today about the update to ADG, which is the policy on sustainability. I just wanted to say first, what is sustainability, since this is a term that is used fairly freely by lots of different people to mean different things. And so what we are looking for is where is the sweet spot between the social, which is the people, the environmental, which is the planet, and the economic, which is the prosperity. So how can we achieve all of those pieces without influencing the future, so that we're able to satisfy those needs today as well as in the future going forward. We want to clarify that the sustainability policy aligns with all of the priorities of the board. We think really, if we dig into any of these priorities, sustainability can play a role in furthering that goal and priority. And so it's a very broad document that encompasses lots of different pieces across the district. As we thought about updating the sustainability policy, we had 3 overarching goals. The first is to focus on decreasing the environmental burdens and increase the environmental benefits in a racially equitable way. And we wanted to support our equity policy. The second is that we wanted to improve the process of how we develop and monitor our sustainability goals and have a better system to integrate those in with our district goals. And the third was to comply with a new state law about electricity reporting. In regards to the first item of having the sustainability policy support our equity policy, we'd like to call attention and remind people of the importance of this work. We know that negative environmental burdens have been disproportionately borne by people of color and people with lower incomes. That is as true here in Baltimore as it is across the state, the region, the country, and across the world. And so there are many, many examples of this. And so that is something that is front and center as we are updating this policy. We also have areas of reflection that we thought about as we were updating this policy. It was really an opportunity to share this work with our stakeholders. We want to know what we're doing well, where we can improve, what issues are most important to our stakeholders, and then looking at other K-12 districts in the region and across the country that may be either a bit further ahead of us or have a different approach to this work, what we might learn from them, and then being sure that we're in compliance with all state and local laws. So the policy has 4 parts to it. There's the main policy, there is the sustainability regulation, there is an energy, water, and resource conservation regulation, and a green cleaning regulation, which then also has a form associated with it. So to remind folks, the sustainability plan is a broad document that sets out large aspirational goals and calls for the creation of a sustainability plan that groups the work and is how we report to the board and to the public on our work going forward. So the plan is broken into these 6 categories and is where the nitty-gritty details and goals and metrics are all developed and then tracked. So the key changes to the policy and the regulation are that we added several statements committing that we will address environmental injustice in multiple places throughout the document. We changed several statements regarding our process. So rather than having a standalone committee dedicated to sustainability, we feel it would be better to have it be more aligned and integrated in with existing processes for creating district priorities, and have that be part of the decision-making process. And then we have language for compliance, so making sure that we are in compliance with the new state law regarding our energy reporting. Additional language that we have made changes on we've added language about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. We have added some language about nature connections among students. We felt that some of the that was a piece that was missing, that it was focused more on sort of environmental literacy standards and straight sort of standards alignment, and that we also are really interested in trying to encourage joy and awe of nature and having students be able to connect to that and experience that. And then also some language regarding green careers and trying to make better connections to increase both the higher education and career opportunities in the environmental fields. So our stakeholder engagement process has been, we have made presentations to a number of different organizations and entities. We have shared out surveys through the Green Schools Updates newsletter that I coordinate, have placed it in our Inside Scoop through our communications office. It has gone out in the PI portal to our partners through the engagement office, reaching out with our teachers who participate in our green financial programming. And so we have made a far effort, and it is not quite where we want it to be. The main push for this was going to be in January and February. As you may imagine, people were preoccupied with our COVID surge that we were facing. We have found that people have survey fatigue and virtual meeting fatigue, and the participation has been a bit lower than we had hoped. We are still working on additional input, and we'll have some additional numbers, I think, to present by the time the full board meeting happens. In the feedback that we have received, however, we have definitely, people have strong opinions and have advice for us. So these are some of the areas that people have spoken about, some of which we were able, or all of which really we've been able to incorporate. I would say that many of the items are more geared towards the plan than really restructuring the entire policy. Many of the things that were asked for are included. But they are great to hear and understand what is of concern to people. So as I say, these numbers have even changed from the time that I submitted this presentation to today. The numbers have slightly changed. We actually have a few more partners presenting now. We have a higher number of people of color who have responded than white respondents. And then I just want to shout out some of our teachers who really did a great job of getting feedback from their students for this as well. One of the questions we asked is, what are your top environmentally related priorities, and had a series of options, and it was a pretty long list. And so this slide shows what were the top 3 for each group of people. So as you can see, students were most concerned with air pollution, mental health, and climate change. Staff stated nutrition and food education, spending time in outdoors in safe, welcoming spaces, and trash and recycling. And our partners were most interested in environmental justice and racism issues, spending time outdoors, and climate change. And then the final column is all of the numbers aggregated together. So the top 3 are air pollution, nutrition education, and environmental justice. I wanted to also just say briefly, why we adopted the policy in the first place and why we focus on this work. We have lots of buildings, we have lots of square feet of space, we have thousands of students, thousands of staff, we use a lot of electricity, we create a lot of trash. We know that our impact can be less that we as an institution make on the earth. We also know that if we can do this work well, that we can have a real impact on our students and our staff, both in terms of their academic outcomes as well as their physical health and mental health outcomes. And our buildings themselves can be crucially important to our well-being and our outcomes. We also know that there are just lots of benefits to incorporating this work into our practices, and more studies every month are generated and released showing all of these different benefits that they have. And so whether it be a better building, whether it be a student participating in a green team, whether it be better air quality in our buildings, all of these things can help us really improve all of our outcomes. So we know that we have come a long way. Our policy first passed in 2016, so it's still relatively new. And we know that we've had a lot of impact over the years and are making good progress. The map to the right shows the distribution of the small green grants that we've made to schools in partnership with the City Office of Sustainability, and sort of showing the distribution across the city for the type of schools, the demographics of those schools. We've really had great participation in that. But we also know that we have a long way to go and that we can do better. We can do better aligning our work with our equity policy, and we can really help define aspirational yet achievable goals that we think can really help in almost all of our other goals achieve success going forward. And so I thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. I welcome any questions that you have. I know there are many documents that were attached as part of the policy, so any questions that anybody has, I welcome them. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you for the presentation. And so, Commissioner McFadden, I wanted to give you an opportunity if you have any questions before I jumped in.
Yep, you can get started, Dr. Commissioner Brooks. I have a couple of thoughts, but I'm also going through the regulations as well. So you can get started.
Sweet. Joanna, thank you so much for the presentation. And I fully support this move in this direction for our work. I think it's really, really critical and super important. I think there were so I guess my first observation was about our equity policy. And so as I was looking through it, I believe I just saw one line that talked about with an equity lens. And so I was like, so I know that it was in the presentation. It's like, okay, that's what we're going to do. But when I think about the application of an equity policy, how are all of the things that were listed in the policy itself? What are the implications around racial equity? And so some of that meant pulling some of the background and the context that you put in the slide with why race matters, and sort of help sort of clarify sort of the significance of this. But then also around what might be done differently if we have an equity lens. What does it mean for who our vendors are, for example? How are we going to sort of approach vendors who are able to sort of embody sort of this value or virtue or perspective that we want while sort of in our buildings or sort of purchasing things from them? So I think for me, those were kind of some of the pieces where I would love to see strengthen and an emphasis on how and what ways does the sort of the racial dimensions of both sort of illness and pollution and so forth, is there additional ways to sort of contextualize what we know about our students in our schools and in their neighborhoods, even if it's by not necessarily every school, but by regions? So for example, where are our incinerators? And I know that there's one in South Baltimore that's blows right into to Cherry Hill and Westport, for example. And and then you start looking at their rates and you see asthma and so forth. So I wonder if while working with I'm assuming you'll be working with the Racial Equity Committee or the group that you all put together, that would be a part of sort of some of the deepening of this, so it doesn't still feel sort of colorblind, if you will. Yeah.
I appreciate your comments, and I have just recently I'm working on a separate presentation about the sort of exactly how sustainability and equity work together. And I think we have done some good work, and the final slide also really applies that we have a long way to go, and that being more intentional about it is something we need to really incorporate in more. And so figuring out where in the policy language to add that. So I think, I think there's 3 or 4 places where we were able to add language in there. And then, like everything, the proof is in the pudding, right? It's like, where does it actually come out, and how are there going to be items that go into, because once this process is complete, we will then go back and update the sustainability plan, which has goals and things. So like, for example, your comment about procurement is a good one. Like, that's something that I think there's a lot of opportunity to figure out. You know, the procurement policy now has language about sustainable purchasing. Right now, the sustainability policy has a focus on equity and the environment, and how do all of those things translate on a day-to-day basis is something that remains something that we will focus on in the coming years.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm excited to hear that. Also appreciated a lot sort of the linking the sort of the outdoorness and sort of connecting students to the enjoyment and wonder of nature. I think that's really huge and a nice fit to sort of the wholeness work and academic work, and sort of being like very clear that at least from my perspective, they're deeply interconnected. And once if we do them well, like we're all sort of having an impact on what the young people said, which was a mental health sort of interest and sort of exploration around that. So I really appreciated that a lot. And I'll pause. Commissioner McManus, did you want to jump in now?
John, my computer is delayed, so I don't know if you all are able to hear in real time or not. Okay, so I see the thumbs up. So I appreciate Commissioner Brooks's thinking around. I would also be interested. We have a poverty index, right? And I would be interested to see some alignment to that map. But in this way, because curriculum is noted within the policy, right? And it's also noted in the regulations. And I appreciate Commissioner Brooks's thinking. I think about what types of lessons our students have access to throughout the city, right? And how relevant the topics and the activities and the lessons are specific to the communities that they're living in. I think we have an opportunity to be innovative there. But when I look at one of the definitions in the regulation, and it goes through the Maryland Environmental Literacy Standards, right? And so apparently COMAR requires every school system to provide students with a comprehensive environmental literacy program in the elementary, middle, and high school grades. I don't know if that is considered earth science, which we see in high school. I'm not sure what that looks like at the elementary or in the middle school level. So could you just color that in, just illuminate that a little bit more briefly? And excuse me, I think I have a student knocking at my door. Give me 1 second. Excuse me.
Also, all great questions and comments. I appreciate them. The first piece, I'm going to start sort of from your last question first, since that's freshest in my mind, the piece about the curriculum and the environmental literacy standards. So Maryland was one of the first states to pass that rule, and figuring out how that actually translates into classroom learning has been a learning curve for everybody. I would say primarily this work falls for our science team in teaching and learning, and figuring out where these units fit into the curriculum. And so the environmental literacy standards were actually passed prior to the next generation science standards. And so then they had to be updated again, because actually the NGSS captured a lot of the items that had been in the original set of the Maryland Environmental Literacy Standards. So between the Sabes elementary science curriculum, the IQuist middle school curriculum, and then the high school science curriculum, there are lots of places where either it is very explicit. For example, we also have to have a watershed experience in each of elementary school, middle school, and high school. So we have spent a lot of time updating the units, finding partners. We are actually working on a project right now funded by the Chesapeake Bay Trust for our 9th grade watershed experience, and really trying to not only have the unit itself be robust, but making sure that it's actually being taught in a robust, culturally relevant, locally relevant way. And so not just learning about, you know, saving the bay, which for some people is not a particularly relevant issue. For others, it may be, but what does it mean to actually go to the storm drain by your school and the park near your home and the stream that runs through your neighborhood? And how do we make sure that that our students have that same experience regardless of where they go to school? And so that's part of the equity piece also, is for a long time, a lot of these experiences have been based on which teacher or which principal valued the work and was able to then find money for field trips and find a partner to help them. And we are trying to take more of that on from a central office perspective and say, all 5,000 of our 9th graders need to have this experience. How do we make this happen year after year after year, and come up with the money for the buses and come up with the money for the partners who can meet our kids at the stream? So that's a bit of a long-winded answer. I apologize, but that it is a multi-pronged piece, and I think there are opportunities to do more. We've done some work with our social studies team because I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But to strengthen our connections with other content areas will also be a goal of ours going forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I understand it. And then I go to in the same kind of, with the curriculum, it's linked to the regulation as well, and I believe that is number 1. Letter C. So it just speaks a little bit more to what you were talking about, right? How environmental education is embedded throughout the curriculum. My thought then is, if we're talking about curriculum in the policy, right, then we go into implementation. There's not much in the there's not much in implementation or in the regulations that talk about how we're going to monitor the academic programming, right? So we talk about, the policy mentions how offices will create plans and how we'll monitor those. I have a thought about that too, like what guidance our offices provided in order to create those sustainability plans. It's another question that I had Commissioner Brooks to ask, how our office is going to be supported in creating those. But then going back to the curriculum focus, how are we monitoring that, right? So if we see all of these changes happening with next generation science standards, the other things that are happening, how are we making sure that students are actually being exposed to this learning K through 12, right? Because the policy mentions not just in our high schools or in our secondary schools, but our elementary schools, to your point, are going to be exposed to it as well. So how do we monitor that? Where does it show up? Then I also have one additional question, Dr. Brooks.
So also all good questions that I don't have perfect answers for. I think it is a learning process, and determining a system for each department to figure out how sustainability goals can fit in with their existing goals is going to be our next step, as I say. So when we develop the sustainability plan, basically, you know, I went around to each department and said, where are there opportunities for us to be working together, and what are goals that you already have that maybe we could either add to or slightly change or are already in sync, and then adding those to the plan, and then that becomes something that is a reportable item that then goes to all of you on an annual basis for how are we achieving that. So for something like the SA-based science curriculum, when we develop, you know, it's going through a rework right now. So we will have different units sort of coded as this is an environmentally related unit. And then we will be able to say, you know, this unit was then taught at these schools and our students had this experience. Now, whether they are able to go and do a curriculum embedded STEM experience that supports, you know, Unit 3, Grade 3 is another challenge that we have. And whether how much of our procurement dollars were actually spent on, you know, this category of vendor are going to be things that we still need to figure out how to track and report those, honestly.
So thank you for that. So, and then also, it just, well, before going, I just want to make sure that if we're putting something in policy, right, that like our policies are mentioning, but policies in essence, right, what we're trying to move toward is like, this is what we believe, right? So that's why we're saying that these policies are governing and shaping our system, where we are, but certainly where we want to go. And if we're mentioning curriculum, I just definitely think that we've got to be intentional and take time in making sure that it's just mapped out before the board approves it, because we want to make sure that we don't just see words, but we're able to, you know, here's a plan of action. If we are going to make sure that students are exposed to this content, K through 12, how will we know? How are we assessing that? How do we know that they've actually learned? If we're going to name it, I think it's something important to truly bake out. And then also I mentioned the support for departments and offices in creating their sustainability plans. So it may not be something, Dr. Brooks, I don't know what your thoughts are. I don't know if it's something that we have to name, but I'm just curious to know, because it would be a lot of work for you on your own, right, to have to support departments and offices. I just want to hear a little bit more information on how they're going to be supported in creating these plans, because that is a part of the implementation or the regulation that the drafts that we see.
Mm-hmm. So to your first point about mapping out the curriculum, if I could just clarify what, because I can certainly work with our teaching and learning and our academics office on adding some information about how we plan to track this for the board presentation. Is that an appropriate response, or is there, just want to be clear.
Sure, the board presentation, but this policy it has a compliance report attached to it, right? So in that compliance report, we can just hear updates on curriculum, and I don't know how you want to word it, but that could be an opportunity to present, not necessarily in a board presentation on the policy. I don't know. Let me sit with it a little bit more and flesh it out, and I can come back or send some questions through about it. And then finally, Dr. Brooks, I want to know where this shows up in our budget, right? In both capital and operating budgets, right? Where does sustainability, where does environmental responsibility, where does that show up if we're looking at, you know, our budget and we're talking about facilities and we're talking about programming? Are there specific places that we can see this if it is a priority? If it's a policy, then that means it's important to us. So where do we see it in our budget, and how we prioritize money to support, you know, sustainability, environmental responsibility, and then the equity piece, right? Maybe some communities and neighborhoods require more than others. So where do we see this in our budget?
So because the work is so disparate and involves multiple different departments, we do not have a sort of sustainability budget that then is allocated to different departments. So in order to figure out how much we have allocated to support this work, it means figuring out where within each of these departments. So for example, within our design and construction team, our schools need to meet a LEED Silver, which is a green building standard. So that costs some money to do that. And that is an allowable expense by the state to put money into, a higher insulation rate and more energy efficient fixtures and things like that. And so that could be counted as budget for programming. Doing teacher training for how to lead a watershed experience and be, an experienced, having Great Kids Farm have all the equipment that it needs to actually host our students to do their watershed experience and have their farm experience and things can be money, some of which is coming from Food and Nutrition Services, some of which is coming from grants, from private funders, or from systemic training money from teaching and learning. So I don't have a fine handle on exactly what the money is. From my perspective, we could always use more, and it would be great to be able to allocate more resources for this work, but it is spread out into lots of different departments at this moment.
Okay, I think it would be helpful when this comes to the board for presentation, for us to go into that a little bit.
Okay.
Deep. For example, your example around learning and training, right? What guidance then do schools and offices receive in developing their budgets to support something like that? So let me flesh that out too a little bit more so that I'm more clear in my ask. It's just I'm curious to know where this shows up in budgeting. But I'll be more clear very soon. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so thank you, Commissioner McFadden, and I believe Ezra just joined us. So welcome, Ezra, Commissioner Ezra. And so so it sounds like one, John, how many people support you? How many people do this work? Your staff size? Okay.
So yeah. I report to Raj Bachubai, who's on the call, who's our energy manager. Mm-hmm. And so she handles all the utility accounts for the district, and then some of the sustainability improvements and recycling, and then myself.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, because it sounds like it's like Matrix, the work, and it also seems similar to sort of like the equity policy itself, which was that it lives everywhere. And Dr. Durant sort of worked with folks to try to figure out what would it look like to sort of for each team to be able to sort of advance that particular goal, or a racial equity goal, for example. So yeah, so I'm sitting with that, and I think for this policy, I feel like what would be helpful which is I think similar to what Commissioner McFadden was saying, to see some of the more aspirational pieces, and not just sort of where we are, but just where we want to go in that sort of direction. What I found to be most intriguing is that what data would we be collecting? Because it looked like there were some really cool potential data points that could show up in the regulation. And so, for me, I would be interested in seeing okay, so what would be a, maybe in the presentation, like what would be a measure to determine the health of city schools in terms of the sustainability? Like if we had to have a rating score, like where are we, and then sort of what is our trajectory forward? And I think sort of in the policy, sort of, being able to talk about sort of the different functions of, or you can think about them in bands, whether it's our curriculum, our sort of physical management or whatever, that there are these areas that we believe that we would hope to see a shift and a change into sort of more sustainability. And as Commissioner McFadden said, for the people who are tasked with completing a plan, that they would actually have support. And, or when you're working with teachers around curriculum, you'd have to have some support there. Because I think one of the things that we talked about in the policy committee, like as a committee before, and I think probably for the last year or so, maybe more, is like, how do we actually crystallize sort of like, what is the frequency of training? What is the frequency of support? Like, how do we know that we're actually moving so that when we see the compliance report, it actually says something that we can actually understand and not just numbers or on a sheet or something like that. So yeah, so I just also probably needing a more staff.
So I know that when in our most recent compliance report, we had discussed the need for not just static information, but change over time. And so that's something that we're going to be working towards including in our next compliance report. And I think also ties into how many goals to set in our policy itself. So some school districts with sustainability policies will say, for example, on energy, we will strive by 2030 to lower our energy consumption by X% from, 2021 or whatever it may be. Some of those goals are hard for us to do because our portfolio is constantly changing. So like that type of goal is not helpful, is not realistic for us. So we need to be looking at it on more of a building by building piece. But there are plenty of other opportunities for us to be setting goals, and those were the pieces that we feel like it makes the most sense to put those into the plan for ease of developing them with staff and partners to make them be aspirational but realistic also, and to have the policy focus on sort of the broader goals of our organization in this work. So I think you'll see more of those details when we develop that plan, which is a staff level document, so it won't come back to you for approval, but it will then be something that will be shared with you and is what we use to report back more so than the policy itself.
Yeah, thank you. And I just have two more things. On slide 14, Dr. Bondima would say, what is the N?
Yes.
So.
Yes, so we are now at about 260 responses.
Okay, great.
Or so. So it's not a huge number, but it's a start, and that we're still, as I say, working to try and improve.
Awesome. And by the way, on slide 15, I love the comparisons and the way that you use the data, the visual there.
I need to do a shout out to our OAA office who helped me with that.
Yeah, yeah. So that was great. So that was it for me. Ezra, Commissioner Ezra, are you on? Did you want to ask any questions about? I know you just joined us, so I don't want to put you on the spot, but just wanted to invite you in if you wanted to.
I appreciate it. Yes, I did join late. I was simply just listening and trying to get an understanding and grasp. Currently, I don't have any questions, but I appreciate it.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you very much for your questions.
Appreciate the work. Yeah,
appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. And so next we'll have an update on board roles.
Good afternoon, commissioners. I'm Josh Sivan, the Chief Legal Officer, and I'm joined by Rebecca Burney, our Assistant Counsel, who's spearheaded the work here and is going to do most of the presentation, but I'll just do a brief framing. This presentation brings together, and we have a very detailed chart that I want you to have in front of you, a lot of work with a lot of offices. And so we're the vehicle and the vessel here, but there's a lot behind this. As you all remember, we moved a number of years ago from rules to policies. And we've had a process over time of evaluating those rules and transitioning those rules, but rules still remain. And so this process was at the request of this committee, which added this to the agenda, and I think it was really important. Where are we on this process? And so to do that, we looked at all of the board rules that existed on board rules. We flagged the rules that already had been incorporated into policy. We then looked at relevant statutes in our policies and tried to start finding what Rebecca very aptly phrased, our policy homes for the remaining board rules. And so that is the work that we're doing and still working on. And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to give details. And just to flag before we do that, that this really aligns with all of our policies, all of the board's priorities, because rules touch each one of those there. So we listed all of them here. Take it away, Rebecca.
Great, thank you. So as Josh mentioned, we started with about 350 board rules. And so over the past several years, since 2007, we've made significant progress in terms of incorporating those rules into board policies. So when we did our initial analysis in January of 2022, we discovered 148 board rules that were not identified in board docs as being repealed or replaced by board policies. After further analysis, we found that 11 of these 148 rules actually had been replaced by board policies, but there was still a website update which was required, and fortunately the board office was able to do that quickly. So as of February of this year, there's 137 active board rules remaining. And so overall, this means that, since 2007, since we transitioned to policies, we've replaced about 61% of board rules. And so when we developed our project plan in terms of how to tackle this, we divided the remaining board rules into 7 categories. The first category is what I already described, which was 11 board rules that actually had already been replaced by board policies and just required a quick website update. The second group was board rules that we recommend the board take action to ratify. These are rules that have already been substantively incorporated into existing board policies. The third group is board rules that are actually already covered by existing federal or state law. And so for this group, we're recommending that the board take action to repeal these rules, because essentially they are repeating legislation and state laws and regulations verbatim. The fourth category is board rules that are no longer relevant or are inconsistent with our current protocols. The fifth category, these are rules that we think we could incorporate into existing policies through the revision process. The sixth category, we're recommending that a new policy or regulation be created to address these board rules. And then the final category, these are board rules that are still under review by the Office of Legal Counsel, as well as other relevant offices, to determine the best path forward. And to the first category, I'll just go over these very, very briefly. And again, you have a spreadsheet that you should be able to reference that has what these rules are in more detail. But this group of 11 board rules, these were already incorporated into board policies. In January, the website update had not occurred, but fortunately now the website accurately reflects that all of these board rules are incorporated and have been replaced by board policies. So the second category, these are board rules that fortunately have already been substantively incorporated into existing board policies. So in many cases, sometimes the policy will refer to a rule and say this policy is related to this rule without directly replacing that rule. And so what happens is that you have the active rule, but you also have a policy with similar or identical information. So an example of this would be Rule 408, which is about school-related travel outside of the United States by students or staff. And this rule is actually covered in board policy IJOA. However, if you look at policy IJOA, you will see it lists Rule 408 as being related to the policy rather than the policy replacing the rule. Another category within Group 2 is rules that are already substantively incorporated into the board policies, but don't directly reference the board rule. So I think in many of these situations, sometimes there was an oversight, or when the policy was being drafted, people didn't think to look at the board rule that was relevant and replace it. And so oftentimes these board policies don't directly reference the rule, but they do include all of the key information. And so our goal is really to streamline our board rules and our board policies to make sure that we don't have duplicate information. We shouldn't have a rule that says something that's identical to what's in a policy. And so an example of this would be Rule 502.05, which addresses enrollment and student transfer protocols, but that's also covered in policy JFC and the regulation JFC RA. And so there are about 23 board rules that we flagged in this category. And so on the slides, as well as in your separate handout, you'll see more detail about the board rules that are specifically in these categories. So the third category, we're recommending board action to repeal these board rules because they are already covered by existing federal or state law. So these board rules actually restate state or federal laws verbatim, and they don't add anything unique to city schools. And we think this is really coming from a time when you weren't able to easily go on the internet and look to see what the law stated. So many of our board rules are just an easy reference point, but not necessary. And so, for example, Board Rule 511 simply restates what federal and state law require with regard to students with disabilities, but there's no need to have these rules because you can just reference the law. And again, many of our policies also reference laws that are relevant. Some of these board rules also reference outdated timelines for implementation, and other board rules cite laws that have since been updated or rescinded. And so there are about 15 board rules in this category. And again, these slides are just an overview of the rules, but you have in your attached spreadsheet much more detail. Okay. And the fourth category, again, we recommend board action to repeal these board rules because they are no longer relevant or inconsistent with current protocols. And so this is just a quick recap of the, let's see, what do you for? 8 rules that we thought fell into this category. And after we spoke with a number of different offices at city schools, we realized a lot of these rules were outdated. Our fifth category, these are board rules that we recommend incorporating into existing board policies through the revision process. So some of these board rules are actually very high priority just due to the board policy revision timelines. And so there are a number of policies that are actually already slated for revision that could easily replace board rules. And so the policy committee's calendar going through this process, an example would be looking at policy KCD. And there's a number of rules. If you look at Rule 303.01 through 303.05, that should be incorporated into policy KCD. Unfortunately, this change is already included in the draft being presented to the board. And so the Office of Legal Counsel is working very closely with relevant offices to make sure that these board rules are being replaced by the relevant board policy when we're going through the revision process. And there are about 27 board rules in this category that could easily be incorporated into existing policies. And again, this is just a quick overview of the board rule and the proposed policy, but you have much more information in your attached spreadsheet. And then the sixth category, these are board rules that we think we should consider creating a new regulation or a new policy to address. And so these really fit into two groups. The first group would be the creation of a student health regulation that would replace board rules 510.01 through 510.06. And we think that these 7 board rules should be converted into a new regulation that would really address student health. And again, like there's one rule that was already incorporated into board policy JLCDB, but the rest of these rules we think would really form a great student health policy, or sorry, student health regulation. The second group is we recommend consideration of a student rights and responsibilities policy or regulation to replace board rule 509.01. And so there are a total of 11 board rules in this category that we think should become a new regulation or policy. And again, this is just a summary of the board rules that we're specifically referring to. And the final category are board rules that are still under review by the Office of Legal Counsel and relevant offices. And so there are about 53 board rules that are still under review. And these rules touch on a number of categories, but some of the major categories are general duties of principals, building and safety maintenance, investment procedures, and asset capitalization. And I just wanted to flag, this doesn't mean that there should be 53 new policies. Many of the board rules could be grouped together into one policy if we decide that it needs to be a new policy or regulation. Some of the board rules may be outdated. We're still meeting with relevant offices to determine the best path forward. And so I will turn it back over to Josh for next steps.
So based on this analysis that Rebecca has walked us through, and it's in more detail in the chart, we recommend that the policy committee consider, and if this makes sense to the policy committee, forward to the full board for action to ratify that the 23 board rules that Rebecca's discussed as already being substantively incorporated into existing board policy. So ratify that, then repeal the 15 board rules already covered by existing federal state law, and the 8 board rules no longer relevant or inconsistent with protocol. So that would take a total of 46 rules, leaving 91 remaining. And then over the next 2 to 3 years, these school staff will work to incorporate the rules that our analysis identified as able to be incorporated, create some new policies to replace 11 more, and then develop a plan of action for the remaining rules, so that when we come to you in over time, we'll be continuing to whittle down and ultimately eliminating and incorporating all these into policy. That's the goal, which we're chipping away towards. And I think the importance of just pacing this out for both the board, and we've seen for both the board and the policy committee and staff, that allows the thoughtful engagement like you were engaging in prior on the sustainability, so that we have really strong policies and regulation with thoughtful engagement. Over to you all for questions.
Yeah, so just first, thank you both so much. I know it's probably other folks in the mix too who supported this, and I remember this conversation coming up a bunch with Chief Perkin-Cohen's even last year sometime around, like, we have so many, we don't want to just keep creating stuff. So I just kind of first just want to thank you all for actually hearing the board and then sort of moving it in this very streamlined and systematic way. And it makes a lot of sense to me. It was easy to follow, and really just it makes sense. And so I guess my only question is actually as an observation. And so on the health, I think it's 510. Let me see what this is. It is 510.06. So I saw that, and I think we should have a whole health policy. So I'm completely in agreement with that. Also, but that language is outdated. around HIV folks being infected. It's, still stigmatizing language. So whatever we do, just, making sure that the language of it is really, really supportive of our students and people who may be living with HIV.
Absolutely.
Commissioner McFadden, do you have any thoughts, questions on this very detailed? Thank you for the summary as well. I like the summary category as well.
I'm ready to repeal these. I think it can go to the board. I think with it, though, we should, I know this will be some work for your team, but creating a brief sentence or two for each of the ones that we're planning to repeal. So you put them in those big buckets, right, for why they're no longer relevant or they're directly language from the law, right? So if that is there, perhaps state that and then provide another brief explanation of what it was and just moving. Am I making sense?
Yes, I think as you were talking, I was thinking that because the policy committee got the in-depth presentation, maybe we can just have a couple slides saying we gave an update and here are the actions, and then that would allow us to go into, I think that's entirely right, have a statement about each one we're repealing.
Yep. And I think that will be helpful to the board. And also, it's a transparent process also to our community so that they understand what is happening as well. I think that's important. I'm definitely ready to do that. But then also another thought was how are we intentionally prioritizing what we do over the next 2 to 3 years in our board as far as the calendar is concerned, right? So this process, thanks to, the policy committee, the policy development process has become a more collaborative process, right? With, members of community, the way that that engagement is happening. There's still areas to grow, but it's becoming better than what it was. Knowing that that is now a part of, the board's expectation, thinking about that engagement process in addition to the drafting and the reader processes, how are we prioritizing time on our calendar, right, to make sure that we can get through the next 2 to 3 years with looking at the remaining 90 some odd things that we have to look at.
And I think that's a really good point. I think that's the next step. And I think in particular to emphasize something that Rebecca Burney stated is that our hope is that we don't end up with 91 policies because a lot of these can be combined and some can be folded in. So our goal would not be, there are a whole number of them about principles and principal responsibilities. As we look forward, it may be that we say, well, those were really actually reflected in other places, but we wanted to give time for the school's office on that. Similarly, there are a number of pieces on investments. That's a meaty subject, but we need some significant planning and engagement before it comes up into the policy and development process. So I think that we really want to plan for success. So we have engagement and then come to you all with really thoughtful work.
I appreciate
especially given everything else going on.
I appreciate that. And for me, as a commissioner, I think the engagement process is the most important process in the development of policies. And so keeping that in mind, just being thoughtful and how because we're in that time right now and creating our calendar for next year, right? And even years to come, just being intentional about that. But this is a lot of work that certainly predates me in my involvement on the board, right? I know that this has been a thing, and I know that Allison, Chief Perkins Cohen, has mentioned several times, right? Converting those board rules and the policy. Same thing with Commissioner James and her work, Dr. James, on this committee. So I'm glad to see the progression and where we are, and then where we're headed. And also, Chief Perkins Cohen, since you popped on, I know that compliance reporting is a thing, right? So how thoughtful are we also being, in the revisions and in how we're looking at that calendar, to your point, Chief Sivan, where do some things overlap so that we don't have to necessarily have a compliance report for everything? And then Commissioner Brooks, as the chair of this committee, to our full board, right? What is the involvement of the full board in this process, right? What are specific things that we need to know as we're developing policies, right? I think that's really important for you to kind of lead us, because you're good at focusing us in that way. We don't necessarily need to report on every single thing, but what is it specifically that we need to know and be reminded of, and where are we going as a result of this policy being adopted or implemented? So I think that's important too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I really appreciate both of you and your, your engagement in this conversation and thoughtfulness about this, and over the long period of time that to your point, both of your points, have been having this conversation. So I really appreciate that, and the work of Rebecca and Josh to really go through it so comprehensively and think about it. And yeah, we still need to keep thinking about how to consolidate it, because I think what we're all saying is, like, we're trying to go for depth and high quality information in terms of the compliance reports, as well as, a coherent set of the key policies that are going to guide our work. And so depth and quality, and not just, the mile wide, inch deep kind of approach to either compliance reports or to policies.
Absolutely. And so I'm excited for the consolidation and the improvement on all of the regulation. I mean, on the compliance reports, right? So, once we get those in place and, all of it sort of working together to sort of tell a really important picture and paint a picture for us, I think that'll be really helpful for the board. And so, Josh, I am also comfortable with, sort of moving this to the full board as well. And really thinking about how, so come to give a presentation, and if there's anything in particular, that you think like, okay, so Commissioner Brooks, you need me to tee up a thing or to sort of contextualize, or I'm totally, open to do that as well. I know that we have Commissioner Ezra. Commissioner Ezra, I just wanted to sort of invite you in to see if you had any reflections. It's a lot of policy stuff in there, in that Excel sheet. Yeah, so one thing that I will lift for us, and I think is when we think about prioritization, I believe we have been in at least conversation for the last year, maybe a year and a half, about our students' rights and responsibilities. And we were supposed to, I believe, going to put out some language about that, and I'm not sure if that actually happened or not. But I think sort of leading and sort of like prioritizing that is sort of one of our key initiatives. Rights and responsibilities.
Right, and pulling together the many different places where that is, and figuring out also where it sits, not just in policy and regulations speak, but also in living documents communicated and shared with students.
Yep, absolutely. Any other thoughts or reflections? All right. Well,
Tanisha has her hand raised, Commissioner.
Tanisha?
So I just wanted to echo the board. This was great work, guys. It was a big lift. Speaking from someone who's been in this work for a long time, this was a big lift, and I just had to add my 2 cents since you extended the opportunity, Commissioner Brooks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
And Tanisha is one of the many partners that without her, this work couldn't be done.
I know that to be true. Yes, indeed. Well, great. So I know that we don't have, Tanisha, am I correct? We didn't have any signups for public comment, did we?
No, you are correct. There were no participants today.
Great. Thank you so much for the presentation, everyone. Just as we begin to sort of wrap up, would like to sort of say a few comments, if my computer actually loads so I can read our agenda. I will sort of call this meeting to close at 4:37. Our next meeting is scheduled for April 19th. It is a virtual meeting. There we'll be sort of discussing IHBJ public charter schools and compliance report, IHCAB, access to appropriate physical education programs. As always, this committee is open to the public, and people can sign up beginning at 9 a.m. on the Thursday before our meeting and up until 5 p.m. The Monday before our meeting date. If you would like to sort of do that, you can sign up by contacting our board office at 443-984-2000 or emailing our board office. Thank you all so much for the time, and we will see you on April 19th. Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Like the lion that I am. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Honestly, when we know people, we don't teach us the perception that we was honest.